Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks at the Freedom Forum, and we're fortunate enough to have as our return guest Bill Daly from New Zealand. Welcome back, Bill.
Hello.
No worries. The home of the what do they call it? The home of the long white cloud. Is that right? I'll just bring you back up so you can answer that one.
It's one of the names for New Zealand. It's a Maori name, as we've been told, the land of the long white cloud. Um, the climate is such that it's often cloudy,
Mhm.
but today was an exception. Here I am in the northern part of the country in Auckland, which very, very seldom has a clear day, but today it did have a very clear day, and tonight it's got a lovely clear night sky out there. Unfortunately, in the city, it's hard to see the stars all that well, but we have had a lovely day. Um, but long white cloud is a reasonable description of the country, I think.
No worries. Thank you for that. Um, Thank you for that. I appreciate the little bit of inside knowledge, of course, from our brothers across the Tasman, and it's interesting because I was thinking, okay, our Freedom Forum, and this particular part brings Bill back again, and I would love to have Bill as a regular contributor to this forum, and I'm thinking that okay, we could call it across the Tasman as just a regular event. But anyway, this weekend just passed, we had several by-elections around Australia because of the citizenship fiasco, where someone may have been a naturalised Australian, but their previous nationality hasn't necessarily been exhaustively relinquished. And on the basis of that situation, we had members of parliament. I think we had five by-elections this weekend just gone, but there's been certainly a lot of disruption and instability within our Senate, especially. As I understand it, 16 senators have now either been dismissed or taken the situation that they needed to stand aside, and so there's been these either replacements, and now we've had the five by-elections, which is in what we call the House of Representatives, the lower house in our Parliament. Now, getting to the crux of my thoughts for today and for this forum is that during the course of casting my vote, my name had to be marked um, off the registry. I think that's the call. I'll remember the right word in a minute. But anyway, historically that's always been a written document, and now it wasn't. It was a computer document, and so the database was updated as I had my name crossed off the electoral roll. That's the word for it, and the database was updated, and I discussed with the official about my concerns that the potential for hacking, which is there. I know that Tasmania had recent elections and their system was compromised, and so to me it's any sort of computer system. I mean, even these smart meters for the power. It's quite common knowledge that crime gangs will hack into your smart meter, reduce your bill, and they take a bit of the cream, a bit of the bill, that money that you'd save. They take a bit of the cream, so it's almost like a bit of protection racket. And of course, for 99.9% of the people out there, they don't have the opportunity to even consider this. They certainly don't have the technology, but if the rewards are great enough, then this is what happens. And systems are hacked. And the point I'm getting at here is that in the electoral roll, it's the potential for systems to be hacked. And the thing is that the official made mention that in the end, elections may even happen from your very own home, that you can actually log in a secure fashion and place your vote and not even attend a polling booth. And that brought up a whole swag of questions in my mind, and the potential is there for us to actually consider this in an entirely different light. And it's not just a matter of once every 3 or 4 years putting so many numbers in a box, but actually engaging in the political process in an ongoing fashion. And I would call that the responsible vote, or the responsible electorate. and I think it's an excellent subject to discuss. And so I've had my two, Bob, at least to describe the scenario as I see it, and now I'd ask Bill to join the fray.
Thanks. I've long been a supporter of the system of, like the Swiss have got, binding referenda. We have a farcical referenda system in New Zealand where if enough people, a fairly large number of people, put their names to a petition, the government, under the legislation, will hold a referendum, but it's not binding. So really it's just a public opinion poll, and a relatively expensive one, in not just in money terms, but in the time that enthusiastic people for that referendum have to go to circulate their petition and publicise it and get enough signatures. And we've had two or three of those, and the government can ignore them. In fact, we had a cabinet minister some years back said that if people are going to, this was, the government wanted to reduce the number of firemen employed on trucks when they go to fires from, I think, 4 to 3. And it was pointed out that very often 3 is sufficient, but there's those situations when 4 is absolutely vital. And they may be only a small number of all the fires that the chaps attend to. And that was a hot issue with the public, and this arrogant cabinet minister, arrogant in my view, said if the public are going to ask for referendums on things they don't have any understanding of, then we'll change the legislation. So we don't have it to the extent that anywhere near the extent that, say, it operates in Switzerland. I'm going to turn my phone off because somebody, excuse me, but I'm going to also close my door because somebody just came and wanted to talk to me, a flatmate. With the way the media operate, elections can be very, very slanted. But I do believe that on many issues, the public have more common sense than what the politicians do, and there's less political pressures on them. Members of Parliament vote along party lines, which is really dishonest because they've been elected there, they get paid by the public to be there as their representatives, and they don't represent them at all, they represent the party bosses. And the party bosses have their own agendas. We don't know often who finances them, what their hoped future personal objectives are, what companies they may go and become directors of, other sorts of international jobs and things like that. All come into it, so that these people don't represent New Zealand or New Zealanders or Australians in your particular case or anywhere else. The political party system, I think, I actually feel it ought to be banned, or at least some strong rules in place that a member of Parliament cannot do anything other than represent his electorate as best he can or she can.
Thanks for that, Bill. That's a very good opening salvo about the problems that we experience across the Tasman with our poor representations in the Parliament by what really are just hacks. They're just party hacks, and the hacks are more doing the bidding of the party leadership, and certainly not doing the bidding of the electorate, which is basically the opposite. Yes, you're right. And it is. It's a fraud. It's a fraud. They go in under false pretenses that I'm going to do more for this electorate. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. They get in and they sit on their hands. Now, this is where it comes to the crunch, because I mentioned the responsible vote and the potential that's there now that we have communication lines such as this. I mean, this is broadband. This is internet. We can discuss these things across around the world on a live basis. And the fact is, with this technology that's there, so is the potential for us to actually continue to monitor our representative and what they're doing, and also to petition. And this is an interesting point, Bill, and that is that a lot of websites now, especially political active websites, they do have online petitions. And so the amount of effort that goes into to become involved in a petition and participate is nowhere near as onerous as it used to be. And so you can actually introduce the software into your website, put up a petition about something, and then if people are interested and drawn to it, their names are there, their addresses are there. It has to be correlated, so it's got to be bona fide, and then that information can go out. Now the fact is, this is a huge opportunity for us if we can think a little bit outside the square, and that is the responsibility. We're saying that the our representative is not being held responsible on a minute by minute basis, and I'm suggesting that it's quite feasible and realistic for the electorate to actually have their representative by the short and curlies. And that can be done on a minute by minute basis, and that's exactly the same way as they say, oh, we can actually have you voting from your home. Well, if they can vote from my home, then they can also I can respond, go into a secure database and respond and say, well, I'm currently thinking that this person here who I endorsed at the election is turning out to be Ned Kelly. He's a rogue, and I'm going to withdraw my support for them. And when it gets to a point where sufficient support is withdrawn, then that person is forced to either stand for re-election or they're replaced by the next person on the election, the next highest person. And so that you could actually have, I'm suggesting you could have a dynamic vote. And then you go, okay, so you're suggesting this is a method of perhaps voting for someone, and it can be variable and flexible enough. And I'm suggesting, yes, it can. You can actually participate. You can become a responsible voter. My name, Arnis Luks, there it is, and I voted for Joe Bloggs. But the thing is, Joe Bloggs is turning out to be Ned Kelly, so I'm going to vote for Mary Smith, because Mary Smith is my next preference, and I think that she'd make a better candidate now than the other bloke, because him and Ned Kelly have got too much in common. That's only a person, but it can also happen in exactly the same way, based on an issue, based on some action that you want the representative to take. Anyway, back to you, Bill.
I can't disagree with any of that. The technology is there. I think Brazil may have used this, if not Brazil, one of the other South American larger countries, for some of their elections. There is, as you said earlier, a negative side, which is hacking. But if it's a recorded vote and a person can check up, I wonder sometimes if we shouldn't have a vote where all records are all kept and available for everyone in the public to see. So there's Bob so-and-so or Bill so-and-so, he voted for this, and it's seen there. The person who voted can see that that's what's written down, that's what's recorded on a site somewhere, and they can confirm that they did vote for that or they didn't. And it might actually encourage greater responsibility to, my family, my friends, my neighbours, my workmates are going to see who I voted for. So I got to take this a little bit more seriously than just having a secret, knowing that nobody can see what I voted for. And I think anything that increases responsibility is a really good thing. There was a suggestion recently by some clown over here that voting should be extended to children. It used to be age 21, and then I think it went either via 20, then down to 18. It's 18 now, and many 18-year-olds don't know very much, but quite a few older people don't know very much either. And if we're only voting along party lines, perhaps it doesn't matter whether we give it to children or not. But if we're forced to be more responsible, and if we actually start to feel that our vote means something and can be effective, and we can sack a member of parliament if we're not happy with him or her, it may be that would encourage a greater responsibility in exercising the vote. I'm aware of the role of the mass media too. On certain issues, euthanasia being one, it's a current one here in this country. Some polls are suggesting that most people would vote for it. I'm personally against it. I think it's an awful policy. There can be manipulation. The British people did vote to go into the EU, but the government kept, basically, as I understand it, way back in the 60s, there was a created economic crisis, as all economic crises are. Didn't happen naturally, and they just let this meander along, and people worried about paying bills and their jobs and all the rest of it, until the propaganda had such an effect, and the desperate plight of the people had such an effect that, oh well, enough people voted for Britain to join the EU, and then they say, oh, it was a democratic decision and all this. That's balmy. That's not true at all. It was a total manipulation, and the media played a massive role in that, and the media does not play a neutral role. However, that said, I'm aware too that there's been referendums in California, Switzerland and elsewhere where the people have actually gone against what the media have wanted. There's a lot of common sense in people in general.
Thank you for that, Bill. That's a very, very important point, and that is that Britain is a very good example. That while there may have been reasons, extenuating reasons, even if it was false reasons, it doesn't matter. The point is that the media has nowhere near the clout that it used to, and the fact is the internet, as far as news sources goes, is causing this whole media thing to collapse in front of us, and that's one of the reasons why we're having further amalgamations in media empires in Australia. It's because their base has to be consistent, and they're supposedly in opposition to the Murdoch and Fox conglomerate. But of course, there's nothing of the sort. They're all in bed with each other, and there'll only be one tune, even if they appear to be in opposition. But getting back to the point, the internet. The internet as a source of news and reporting is huge. And this natural news is providing an alternative to YouTube. YouTube originally, don't tell lies, now manipulated. Now it's sanitizing services. It's doing everything that it said it wouldn't do, and it's just another organisation that's gone down the gurgler, driving its own philosophy, its own point of view, and not being independent. And it should have maintained its independence, and it never did. So I think it's an interesting scenario where the media manipulated Britain, but in the end, Cameron made a mistake. He said, if something happens, I'm going to give a referendum. He made a tactical error, and then they had the referendums, and the Brits threw it out. And now you've got the Murdoch selected candidate, Theresa May. She was not elected by the Conservatives. She was selected by Murdoch, and then, as I put in words the other day, skulkingly endorsed by the political hacks. But as far as the vote goes, as far as the Conservative Party and having a national vote for the future leader and Prime Minister, nothing of the sorts. And Murdoch selected her as the media mogul, and her task was to bring about no Brexit whatsoever, and she's achieved exactly that. And the fact is that even the threat of another vote, in Britain, still may not achieve what the people need, and that is they want separation from the EU, and they want to sort out their own life. Now, I'll remind people here a little bit of history, and I wrote it in the previous New Times. It's just come out last week, and that was that in 1100 there was a coronation charter, and it was essentially binding the monarch of the day to adhere to traditional customs and practices. This is 1100. Now, this continued on. This campaign of attempting to pull the monarch in continued all the way through the 1100s. 1215, the Baron Stephen Langton forced John into signing or putting his seal on Magna Carta. He immediately broke it. The Pope, is it Pope Pius III? He declared it null and void within a year, and it was forced again. John died in 1216, and so the next, which was John's son, took over, and his now what's it called? Is it a regency government or whatever? Either way, he was a minor, and so the government of the day endorsed Magna Carta again in 1216, and then finally, I think it was John's grandson in 1297, finally made Magna Carta common law. incorporated within the common law. Now, the first rule, the first article in the Coronation Charter and Magna Carta is that the church will be free, inviolable. Now, Henry VIII brought the church within the realms of the state, and so that was the end of the independence of the church. Now, what I'm getting back to on this is that the battle is not won and lost in one push. The battle is ongoing and sometimes takes hundreds and hundreds of years to actually have an outcome that's satisfactory, and that outcome can be lost. Now, Magna Carta, more than 800 years ago, and most of those gains that were there were the rights and goods and chattels and things like that, common law rights. I mean, we've got politicians doing it today. They're undoing it at every chance. And the fact is, we're heading towards or being immersed in totalitarianism, and that is the dictator. We're heading back to the point where the power of the monarch, the power of the king, is being usurped by the power of the party leadership. And when I say usurped, I mean it's being taken away from Parliament. It's being taken away from the representatives and the electorate, and it's being placed in the leadership of the party. And that says to me that we've got to come up with something new. And that's what I'm suggesting, is that this issue of responsibility of the vote, we've got to take a good hard look at it and how it works and how we can actually build from it onto something that's going to be sustainable. Bill?
Yes, that's right. Interestingly, Stephen Langton, he was with the Barons when they forced King John at Runnymede to sign Magna Carta, give a signature to it. Stephen Langton was Archbishop Stephen Langton. So the church, in my view, has a role to play, but it has to be an independent church, but it has to be a cooperative effort with the state. Sort of a guardian of the people's rights, and also a guardian of protecting the state's genuine rights against revolution and things like that as well. And this whole thing of the so-called separation of that we've had fed to us for several hundred years, separation of church and state, and it's a terrible thing if one's interfering with the other and all this kind of stuff. Religion, or the governing principles of a society, cannot be separated, in my view, from the administrative aspect of the state. There was a time, I don't know up until what period, but there was a time when an innocent person who might be pursued by the state, by the sheriff, could seek refuge in a church, and the church would protect that person. If they'd got inside a church, and I guess it didn't work in every case, but if they were actually a common thief or a murderer or a wife basher or something like that, then the church would basically throw them out, and they'd have to face the justice of the land. But if charges against them couldn't be proven, and it was just a political setup, the church had the responsibility to protect that person. That's just one aspect of the role of church and state. I think there's been a nefarious campaign on behalf of propagandists who want to destroy our society and destroy freedom behind this whole thing of the church must never interfere in the affairs of the state. And then, of course, we've had weak church leaders who, in many views, have probably lost their Christian faith, but still have the title, who just go along with whatever the state wants, and will not stand up for the traditional principles of the Christian religion, and will actually allow many laws to pass without even commentary on it. It's if church people stand up, it's usually the laity. So this is a slight diversion from what you were saying, but I think it's connected. The role of the church is a very important thing, which is why the church is probably, the church and Christianity has been so attacked so often. But I often think of when Christ said that those who aren't with me are against me, it indicates there's a war between good and evil. And I agree, you're 100% correct that the battle doesn't stop. It's not like, oh, we're going to, and next year we'll have won the battle and the New World Order's all finished and hooray, we're going to be free and happy for the rest of our lives. There is a constant war, and it's something to do with this life we've been given, and it challenges us, as it should. Sometimes it ends up in a military war. Hopefully, as much as possible that can be avoided, but it does work out that way sometimes. In all shapes and whatever forms it comes in, evil as an opposition to good um, has to be opposed, and you can't do that without having some type of conflict. And this comes through in all areas, and I think getting back to this thing that the church must play a role in the governing of, not the direct governing, but in the in imposing or insisting that moral factors have to be taken into account and justice has to be taken into account in all activities that the state involves itself in.
That's a very interesting truth that you've touched on there, Bill, and that is that the actual strength of your faith, if you like, or the resolve of your thinking, is actually reinforced by the greater the gloom that's around us. If life is rosy and too easy and too simple, and we're in the Garden of Eden, and there's no stress and no demands placed on it, well then okay, right, let's eat, let's drink, let's be merry. There's no point in anything other than that because life is too easy. But in actual fact, that's right. We are in a battle of ideas, and the fact is that 2,000 years since Christ, 2,000 years now, 2,000 years you had in the Roman Empire, life and death. You had that the parents of a child could put the child to death under 2 years of age. You had that he was the Caesar of the day, crucified Christ, based on what, hearsay? Based on hearsay in an open slanging match. Had him beaten to a pulp, and then crucified. What was the charge? No charge. No charge. Unproven, no charge. Now we've evolved 2,000 years, we've got trial by jury. We have to have someone testify under oath, this is the truth, and be cross-examined. These are the evolution of thinking. They're the development of our civilization. They did not come easy. They came at a price. And every part of their coming was like childbirth. And that's where we are now. We are going through convulsion after convulsion, civilizational convulsion. And the fact is, what is the new life that we hope to aspire to? What is the new hope that we can place? That seed of faith, that vision of something splendid that we can actually present to generations to come. Because that's where we are. We do nothing, fine, we go back to the Dark Ages because that's what's going to come. Or we can try and think this thing through, this thing of ideas where we're wrestling, and try and come up with methods where we can actually resolve the issues, and instead of revolution, we have resolution. Bill.
Yes, yeah. Um, Something that always inspires people is stories that tell the history of their own people. We've been cut off from that, very much of that, in the modern Western world, and I think that's deliberate. But stories of heroism, um, somebody in a battle and it looked like your country was, or your side or your ancestors were going to lose, and then somebody rose up and they offered the leadership and the courage and they were prepared to die, and they went forth and they won. And these things become part of that general folklore which nations need to be built upon, and which give people courage and inspiration of, well, so-and-so did this in the past, and what a wonderful inspiration, what a wonderful hero. And we need heroes. Robin Hood is a hero. the story may not be exactly true, but he's an archetypal, typical hero of the English people. I've thought quite a bit about this. One of my favourite movies is the 1939 movie with Errol Flynn playing, it's a swashbuckling movie, Robin Hood. Um, and Robin Hood wins, and Robin Hood is totally just. He comes from an aristocratic family, he's been dispossessed of his land, he's been lied about, and the sheriff is evil. Interestingly, the bishop is evil too. Um, and I kind of like that part because I think it's quite realistic. Um, and he rises, he overcomes the evil, the people are with him, and he doesn't set himself up as some proud dictator after that. The story kind of ends there, but in the folklore of the English people, what's represented is something that the hero came and he stood up for the common people. He didn't try to tear down the existing order. He acknowledged that there's a place for aristocracy, there's a proper place for leadership, but that leadership has to be honest, it has to be properly representative, it has to be just. And this, I would think, inspired the English people for hundreds of years and would still be inspiring many of the English people, just that story. And there are other stories as well. And other peoples have similar stories that give them inspiration and well, all the fighting that went on in the past to preserve the freedoms that I've got now, I better do something about that. And I have a friend, and she tells wonderful stories. She grew up, her early childhood was in Croatia. She's getting on in years a little bit, and during the Second World War with her mum and dad, she was an only child, they moved to Germany, and it kind of worked out in the long term for them. Her father got a job there. The war ended and they came to New Zealand as refugees in the years after the war. But she makes it clear that her mother, outside of the school system, her mother, and she believes that this happened in most cases with children in her country at that particular time, her mother taught her the history of her country, taught her the songs. She's not so much the father. And this was a role that I would say mothers have generally always had, teaching their children the folklore. And in Christian societies, that would include the heroes, military heroes, saint heroes, people who stood up to tyranny, maybe died for it, and they become a hero. And these stories are told to the next generations. And I think it's lovely when she tells me that, because she knows her history, her family history, and her native history, this particular lady, very well, and she learnt it from her mother. And I think it's just wonderful that something like that is carried on like that, and if it's correct that mothers pass this on, dads too, of course. I have a friend in the States who's a very good commentator on things, very practical, very just cuts through the chase, in my view, cuts through the rubbish and gets to the point. He talks about the Christian faith and the European civilization was handed down at the fireside. And I think that's part of the problem of modern schooling. It's tried to replace the role of parents, aunties, uncles, grandparents in passing down their family history, their community history, their national history, stories of the heroes, the folklore that went with that. Because you don't get that through a centralized so-called educational system. It's a schooling system. It's not really educational in most senses. And much of it is propaganda and lies anyway. Which is not, I don't want to deride teachers. They teach what they're told to teach by the state. And much of it might be correct, but it leaves out 95% of what children need to know if they're to grow into good citizens and healthy citizens and proud citizens. These days, and it's the same in your country, it's the same worldwide in the Western world anyway, that we're basically taught, not just the younger generations, but my own generation as well, we were taught to have a derision for our history, as if, oh, we came to New Zealand and all we did was beat up the Maoris and stole their land, and you did the same to the Aboriginals over there. And the Americans have had this as well, the Canadians have had it, and it's BS. Of course things happened, and you can highlight instances, but it's basically an evil program designed to destroy a people. And that's one of the problems of the Western world these days, is we're cut off from the truth of our heritage and so many things that we should be proud of. The music, the architecture, the literature. There's so much there that we absolutely, the heroes we need to be so proud of, and we're cut off from that.
Mm. Thank you for that, Bill. That's beautifully put. We're at the 35-minute mark already. This has gone really, really quick. Um, I agree with you. The British have in their flag the St George's Cross, and that depicts St George going after the dragon and slaying or controlling the dragon. And of course, a lot of paintings of St George doing that, archetypal type paintings. You mentioned the word archetypal, and I agree with you. It's where someone risks everything going after something of great value, and they face the demons. They really face a threat, and that's what the dragon is about. And St George um, brings back the virgin or brings back the gold, and that's what I'm referring to in our situation. Is you've brought it into practical terms. I brought it into perhaps conceptual terms of how can we actually start to come to grips with the dragon that is this totalitarianism that's coming at us like a steam train, and our politicians and our bureaucrats are doing nothing to stop it. Certainly not the religious leaders. They're in bed with them, and they're on the basis of that. What are we to do? And it comes back to the individual. It comes back to the individual taking on a mantle that's actually even beyond themselves. Now, in the last week or so, I've been reading some different people, and in the course of reading these different people, they've referred to the Superman. Nietzsche, as I understand it, referred to the Superman. It's the individual going after something that's quite difficult and not trying to just hold on to what's there. Now, to me, totalitarianism is all about subduing any initiative, anything new. It's about putting everyone in a straitjacket, everyone in a box, and no one moves. And you can't even think out of line. Whereas the Nietzsche Superman is that no, you go out there and you see what's out there, and you are creative. You take the initiative, you explore, you question, you poke, you probe, you evolve the thinking. Now, I think that Steiner referred to the Uberman, the overman, and as I understand it is that same type of archetypal personality that each person can take on. That's the challenge. That's the challenge. Anyway, that's this is me. I'll send it back to Bill for closing comments. Bill.
Interesting talking about St. George, the patron saint of England. Isn't it interesting that our countries, all of the European countries, had what was called patron saints? And children were taught that this is a saint you can appeal to for um, a little bit of extra help or for protection for your country, protection for your family. And I find it really interesting that, well, I think some of the people in the early church were quite wise. They established a system of saints for different things. So for a patron saint of farmers, a patron saint of homemakers, of mothers, and people could appeal to these saints. And to me, that said that the religious thing that they respected at the time, call it religion, whatever, but this thing that they respected that connected to them to the spiritual world was a living thing. It wasn't theoretical. It was something that entered into our lives, people's lives, every moment of every day. I was brought up with the Catholic thinking, and we were also taught that we had guardian angels. And I remember my my parents had up on the wall when we were children a picture of a guardian angel overlooking a couple of children walking through the forest. And I guess this was to give children confidence that if they're scared or out in the dark or something like that, there's help available. There's a source of protection there which goes beyond just the immediate physical reality. Atheism is a sort of religion. It is really a religion in that it's on a belief system, because at the end of the day, an atheist can only say, well, this is actually what I believe. he can't prove anything any more than I can prove right now that Christ is present everywhere. I believe he is, but I can't prove it at a physical level. I believe that, and I believe it totally. Um, an atheist will say, well, that's just your belief, and I can say the same towards an atheist. But these challenges to us force us to think more deeply and force us to think things through and come up with explanations for why we feel something. And it may well be a man I correspond with a little bit on the net, and he publishes a posting. Very astute man. He sent me something the other day, and it was actually from a rabbi. And this Jewish rabbi was talking about how they saw, or how he saw, or his group of, because there's so many divisions within Judaism anyway, and saw the role of Satan. And it was I can't think of the word right now, but it was the person who takes the devil's advocate is a term we use, and that for him the reality was that God had created the universe, but in order to test us, he'd created an opponent of himself. I don't think that's quite the Christian view, but I thought that's a really interesting thing. I mean, I do believe Satan is consciously evil, and people who followed that rule follow that the way. At a certain level, there is conscious evil. The majority of people doing evil aren't probably conscious they're doing it. They've been conned or allowed themselves through pride or whatever to undertake to do evil and pretend that they're doing good. But there is conscious evil. But I thought it was really interesting that this rabbi had the view that this was something established by the Creator in order to test us. And that this life is a test, and it is kind of a test. So there's much we don't understand, but getting back to what I was saying, that these systems of help, which in the older Christian tradition was absolutely vital. I'm not saying it was absent in the Protestant tradition either. There's much there to be admired, but we've been cut off from honest examinations of many of the movements that have disrupted the Christian world, split the East from the West, and brought about the Reformation. There was certainly much wrong in the Catholic Church at that time, but whether you have a revolution and split the whole thing down the middle and or whatever is discussions we ought to be having. But there's so much history we're cut off from, and the mass media has so much to answer for, in my view. They've tried to fill us up with shallow stuff, and some of it's entertaining, but it's shallow. It doesn't allow us to put deep roots down, to think about our connection with the past and what we may be able to pass on to future generations. We've become shallower and shallower until the modern world is an extremely shallow place.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Bill. That's beautifully put, and certainly a thought-provoking discussion at the Freedom Forum today across the Tasman. Arnis Luks. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, will come a waltzing Matilda with me.